In this talk, as we're coming to the wrapping up of our time together, and it's been a very peculiar time, I'm sure, trying to work through these different lectures that we've been doing on Bob Marley and the Wailers. And of course, you've been writing these really thoughtful and insightful journal entries, looking at different areas of Marley's life and work. And of course, sharing your thoughts and insights in your Marley and Me um, essays, personal essays. I want to spend some time looking at the literature, the larger literature that has been written about Bob Marley and around Bob Marley's legacy and work, which continues to grow as time goes on. One of the things I try to make note of in my syllabus, and of course in some of the notes that I sent to you, with regards to the plethora of websites that exist, which have to be read with very, incredible amount of care and consideration. I think we've seen emerging a number of specialist websites that focus on reggae music, that focus on Bob Marley's music, in which these reviewers essentially give these summaries of the different albums, but they're very contemporary, they're very present day reviewers looking back at the Marley albums. And one of the curious things about it is that the vast majority of these people who are writing these pieces are not Jamaican and have very little knowledge of Jamaican culture, Jamaican society, and frankly, about the history of reggae music itself and the evolution of reggae music. In many instances, these commentaries and reviews sort of betray themselves by misunderstanding some of the lyrics of Bob Marley simply because they don't understand either the culture or the language. They also are predicated on a very complex idea that I've talked about a little bit before, but it's worth sort of paying careful attention to. It surrounds the idea of the perception of Bob Marley and the ways in which this very, very generous and hopeful notion. It's almost a positive idea that we make of our stars, we make of our heroic figures, what we desire them to be, and we seek in them a way in which we can consider them made in our image. We can consider that there's an affinity between us and them. And one of the challenges that has existed, certainly in American culture and in world music culture, has been the preponderance of music produced by black artists, certainly in the last 30 years with hip hop, and of course, prior to that, with reggae music, with African music, and so on. And it's a preponderance and presence with soul music, with the music of Motown as well, of this music written by artists who are in themselves are existing in a manner in which they are shunned by that society. In other words, when Nat King Cole is a hit in the world in the 40s and the 50s, he's also somebody who cannot go into certain hotels in America. He's somebody who is part of the denigrated people. So there's this peculiar sort of twisted understanding of self. Almost, we can call it a kind of schizophrenic, in the most colloquial way one can use that term, sense in which there are many, white society has this complicated relationship with these artists whose music they are drawn to, whose music they are moved by, but who in person and in identity and in place and in their reality of the world, there's this divide and there's this frisson. And so it then begs the question: what happens to 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 the consumer, and largely white consumer, when they are moved by and drawn to this music, and yet are not able to reconcile that feeling with their actual lived relationship, and in some instances, a lived relationship that doesn't have human contact, actual human contact, with the purveyors of that music, the makers of that music. Marley presents a very complex problem in that regard, not only because there's that racial divide, but it's also that national divide. Marley is a Jamaican. Marley is a foreigner. Marley is not an American. Marley is not a British man. And so there's that already that divide. But at the same time, Marley is beautifully and very shrewdly being marketed to a population, usually university students, in the 1960s and 1970s, the early 1970s, were the target audience. That people like Chris Blackwell in with Island Records would seek to connect with Marley, and therefore that was a rock based consumer, and that Mali begins to take root amongst that population. So the things that create the connection would be the ideas of a kind of counterculture, the ideas of a hippie culture, and so on. And of course, there's a stark sort of identity of Mali, a kind of attractive figure, somebody who is attractive and interesting, but somebody who is a rebel, and in a rebel in a very accessible way, a rebel who is a smoker of marijuana, a rebel who is creating a music that is weird and funky and kinky and strange, and a rebel who built into their musical sort of identity, at least as it's perceived, has a kind of sexual appeal at the same time. Yet the irony of it all is that what Mali is conveying and what Mali is singing is complicatedly a veritable attack on the infrastructure of white supremacy and white society. And so that Mali himself is singing in song after song, we don't know how we and them are going to work it out. He's singing songs about Babylon and Babylon system. And within the Rastafarian culture, Babylon system is literally connected to all those societies and cultures that have oppressed and exploited black people, and African people. And so Mali is a purveyor of Africanness. Mali is a purveyor of justice against the oppression of apartheid, of Jim Crow, of all that racism, and implicating the very people who are the consumers of his music, which gives the consumers of his music a profound problem. So one of the ways in which that is reconciled and that is somehow solved by the consumer is to create in Mali a notion of Mali as both a strange fellow, a kinky fellow, a counterculture fellow, and a fun-loving fellow, and a person who is more one love, one heart, versus let's get together to fight this holy Armageddon. All these two things are in the same song, but the part that we are drawn to and that we pay attention to is the one love, one heart. The idea is that by limiting Mali, by limiting the perception of Mali to the things that feel good to this white consumer, that Mali then becomes accessible and becomes palatable and becomes attractive, and then it can be owned. And this is exacerbated and complicated by the very fact of the historical fact that Bob Marley himself was of a mixed race heritage. And so Marley being partly white, in one interview would say that I part of me is white, and therefore I can't hate white people. Marley says that in one interview. Um, but at the same time, sort of in all his other sort of articulations and expressions, and of course the experiences that he has as a touring artist, are those in which the very racist infrastructure of many of these societies has been imposed upon him. So then what happens is that the consumer latches onto this idea of Marley as somebody who is partly them. Marley then is becomes the everyman figure, the figure that can connect with them. And therefore, in the reviews, there is a fixation on those elements. The other sort of stereotype and construction is the limited understanding of Jamaican society by presenting Jamaican society primarily as defined by its presumed poverty, without defining what this poverty is, defining what this cultural, what this idea of poverty represents. Because of course Jamaica is a society in which there's at least three classes of individuals, and these are economic classes as well as sort of classes of education and so on and so forth. That Jamaica is a country of highly educated people. Jamaica is a country of religious people whose religion is not Rastafarianism by any stretch. Rastafarianism, at least during Marley's time, represented at most 2 or 3% of the population. The rest of the population, almost 80 to 90% of that population, is Christian and evangelical Christian, or traditional Christian, and then some percentage of it is Jewish, and then there are other religions, Hindu and so on and so forth, much smaller in Islam. But Jamaica is predominantly a Christian country. Again, many of these reviewers are latching on to this idea. And then finally, there's the mysticism surrounding Marley. And the mysticism then creates a mysticism that undermines the explicit political articulations of Marley, the explicit political expressions of Marley. And the politics are global. The politics are global. We refuse to be what you want us to be. We are what we are, and that's the way it's going to be. You can't educate us for no equal opportunity. Talking about freedom, people's freedom and liberty. It says you're building church and university, deceiving the people continually, graduating thieves and murderers. They sucking the blood of the sufferer, and then tell the children the truth. Tell the children the truth. Marley's articulation is clearly against the infrastructure of colonialism, imperialism, Babylonian system, all the elements. But then in reinterpreting Marley as a kind of mystic, a sort of mysterious figure, a guru who is always expressing peace and love, is a false, limited perception of Marley, but an accessible and a palatable understanding of Marley. So these reviewers, coming from that perspective, begin to create a narrative that obviously misunderstands what Marley is doing. So I mentioned this because one of the books that I've recommended for us to pay attention to is the Marley Reader. It's a fantastic compilation of reviews, articles, commentaries. And one of the great things about this reader is that a lot of the pieces that are contained in it are contemporary to Marley when Marley was alive, when Marley was performing. And it also helps us to see how when Marley is first met by reviewers in Rolling Stone and Spin Magazine and so on and so forth, the way that they misunderstand Marley, the way that they struggle with understanding Marley and engage Marley, and yet they begin to see Marley's growing popularity. So one of the useful things about that document, that book, is that it brings together all these articles. And it also has done well to include articles by Jamaican musicologists, Jamaican music scholars, and of course Jamaican popular music reviewers and commentators, and that allows us to have a good cross section. One of the things that is really, really encouraging that I've seen in some of your journal entries is that when you go to these contemporary websites, which of course I discourage you from doing, but a few of you still went to these websites and pulled up these reviews, which are contemporary reviews. You, by that point, had enough immersion in our discussion about Marley's lyrics and Marley's work that you could see the flaws, you could see the shortcomings, you could see the critical problems with some of these reviewers, and you were able to identify them. And this is hugely important because, of course, one of the things about it is not to presume that because something exists and it's articulated in an article or has a stamp of seeming authority, that it is quite right. So one of the ways I would say to use the this work, this Three Little Birds, the Bob Marley Reader, is to use it as your source for both record reviews, but especially for your critical reviews and to some extent for your literature reviews, because of course they offer you some wonderful insights into that work. There are many sort of what we call witnesses. Witnesses who were present with Marley, who write about Marley's work, many who toured with Marley, who travel around following Marley, some who had encounters with Marley. And it's worth paying attention to those people, but also recognizing, of course, their limitations, and recognizing that it is not necessarily the case that even when somebody actually plays in a band with Marley, that they always understood what lyrically Marley was doing and what the sources of Marley's lyrics and Marley's ideas might have been. So I'd encourage you to dig into that, especially when you're doing your last set of reviews and your last set of journal entries and commentaries, because I do think that it's a particularly useful document to pay attention to.